On the 2nd of December 2001, the Enron Corporation, once hailed as a star of the business world, filed for bankruptcy. It was a shocking and sudden collapse, a fall from grace that left employees stunned, investors outraged, and an entire country asking how one of its biggest companies could die almost overnight. To put it in perspective, Enron was the seventh largest corporation in America at the time. Its stock, which had traded around $90 a share a year earlier, was now worth barely more than a few quarters. In total, more than $60 billion in stock market value evaporated. In a matter of weeks, a company that had seemed invincible had imploded. How did this happen? The story of Enron's rise and fall is a tale of ambition, innovation, and deception. It's the story of smart, aggressive executives who pushed boundaries, then crossed the line, and of how their house of cards eventually came crashing down. To understand the downfall, we have to start at the beginning, back when Enron was a rising star and could seemingly do no wrong. Enron began in the mid-1980s as a fairly traditional energy company. It was born from a 1985 merger of two pipeline firms and was led by a charismatic executive named Kenneth Lay. Lay had a grand vision to transform this regional pipeline business into something much bigger. He seized on the deregulation of energy markets in the 1990s, which allowed companies like Enron to trade gas and electricity freely. Instead of just transporting energy, Enron could now buy and sell energy contracts like a commodity. Lay brought in a bright consultant named Jeffrey Skilling to help Enron take advantage of this new landscape. Jeff Skilling was brimming with ideas on how to revolutionize Enron's business and its accounting. One of his key moves was to adopt an accounting method called mark-to-market. This method would let Enron book future profits on the very day a deal was signed, instead of waiting years to see if those profits actually came in. In theory, mark-to-market could reflect the present value of a long-term deal. In practice, it gave Enron a license to declare hefty profits based on optimistic projections. In 1992, Enron got official permission from regulators to use mark-to-market accounting. Almost immediately, Enron's reported revenues and profits surged. The company looked like it was growing at a breakneck pace, year after year. Wall Street was dazzled. Enron's stock price skyrocketed as the company delivered what appeared to be steady, impressive growth. The business media hailed Enron as an innovator. Fortune magazine named Enron America's most innovative company for 6 years in a row in the late 1990s. Enron expanded beyond natural gas into electricity trading, then into all sorts of other markets. It invested in high-speed broadband networks, launched an online trading platform, and even dabbled in ventures like weather derivatives and a video streaming service. To the outside world, Enron seemed to be a company that could do anything and do it well. It wasn't just an energy company. It was a cutting-edge financial powerhouse, but behind the scenes, all was not what it seemed. The problem with counting on future profits is that reality often fails to match the forecasts. Many of Enron's bold ventures started to falter even as the company was booking them as big wins on its financial statements. Take the example of a deal Enron made in 2000 with Blockbuster, the video rental chain. Together, they announced a plan to launch a new video on-demand service, a pretty forward-thinking idea at the time. Enron was so eager to tout this venture that as soon as the contract was signed, it recorded over $100 million in projected profit from the deal. In Enron's books, that money was as good as in the bank. In reality, the project never got past a pilot phase. It fell apart within months because the technology and demand weren't there. Under normal accounting, Enron would have had to report that deal as a failure and take a loss. But under Enron's accounting, those losses were hidden. On paper, Enron had already counted the Blockbuster experiment as a huge success, and the failure was swept under the rug. So, what did Enron do when its bets went bad and the real profits didn't show up? They found ways to hide the mess. This is where Enron's story shifts from aggressive business tactics to outright fraud. Enron's chief financial officer, Andrew Fastow, was the architect of a scheme to keep the company's troubles out of sight. Fastow created a web of secret partnerships and entities, what accountants call special purpose entities, that existed mainly to absorb Enron's losses and debt. He gave these partnerships bland or cryptic names like LJM and Raptors. and he funded them with outside money that was often backed by Enron's own stock. Here's how it worked in simple terms. Enron would transfer some losing assets or contracts into one of these off-the-books entities. In exchange, that entity would appear to pay Enron, so Enron could record revenue or avoid recording a loss. Meanwhile, because the entity was separate on paper, Enron's own financial statements wouldn't show the debt or losses related to those assets. It was like sweeping dirt under a rug and then proudly proclaiming you had a clean floor. Of course, the dirt was still there, just hidden. These maneuvers were incredibly complex, and Enron went to great lengths to keep them secret. Even experienced analysts found Enron's financial reports almost impenetrable. Few could figure out what Enron was really doing. Amazingly, Enron's board of directors allowed Andrew Fastow to run this scheme despite the glaring conflict of interest. Fastow was effectively making deals with himself, representing Enron on one side and these partnerships on the other. In the process, Fastow and a few insiders pocketed tens of millions of dollars for themselves. But as long as Enron's stock kept rising, no one, not the board, not the executives, not the investors, was eager to ask hard questions. The illusion of success was benefiting too many people. Enron's internal culture only fueled the fire. The company was driven by a culture of extreme competitiveness and short-term results. Skilling had instituted a rigorous performance review system that routinely culled the bottom performers, a practice nicknamed rank and yank. This created an environment where employees were motivated to meet targets by any means necessary, and where bad news or ethical doubts were quickly suppressed. Many employees sensed something wasn't right about Enron's numbers, but challenging the status quo was a quick way to end a career. So most stayed silent, or assumed that the higher-ups had it under control. Still, a few outsiders began to pick up the scent that something was off. Some journalists and analysts wondered how Enron could consistently make so much money in volatile markets, and why its finances were so opaque. In early 2001, during a conference call with investors and analysts, one skeptical analyst pressed Enron's leadership for clearer financial information, essentially asking, "How exactly does Enron make its money?" Jeff Skilling, by then the CEO, lost his temper at this unwelcome scrutiny. He snapped back at the analyst, calling him an asshole in front of everyone on the call. It was a shocking breach of professional decorum, and it raised eyebrows on Wall Street. Why would a CEO react so angrily to a reasonable question? In hindsight, Skilling's outburst was a sign of how desperately Enron's executives wanted to avoid scrutiny. By the middle of 2001, things were starting to unravel behind the scenes. In August of that year, out of the blue, Jeff Skilling resigned as CEO, just 6 months after taking the post, citing personal reasons. The news stunned investors and employees alike. Skilling had been seen as the genius driving Enron's success. If he was bailing out, what did that say about the company's health? Ken Lay stepped in as CEO once again to calm the ship, assuring everyone that Enron was as strong as ever. But Skilling's abrupt departure was a huge red flag that few recognized fully at the time. Inside Enron, one person in particular knew the company was teetering on the brink of disaster. Her name was Sharon Watkins, a vice president who had stumbled upon the dubious accounting tricks that Enron was using. Just days after Skilling's resignation, Watkins wrote a memo directly to Ken Lay. In it, she warned that Enron could soon implode in a wave of accounting scandals. Imagine the alarm of reading those words from a company insider. Watkins laid out her concerns about the off-balance sheet deals and the shaky foundation of Enron's reported profits. Ken Lay says he was surprised and disturbed by her memo. He had Enron's lawyers and accountants look into the issues. But ultimately, the company's public stance didn't change. Enron executives continued to insist everything was fine, even as Watkins' warning hung in the air. By October 2001, Enron's facade was cracking wide open. That month, the company stunned the market by announcing a huge quarterly loss and a $1.2 billion reduction in shareholder equity, largely stemming from those mysterious partnerships that were finally coming back to haunt Enron's books. Not long after, Enron confessed that it would have to restate its financial results for the past several years. In other words, The company admitted it had been overstating its profits and hiding debt. In total, Enron acknowledged that it had overstated earnings by hundreds of millions of dollars since the late 1990s. This was the moment the world began to understand that much of Enron's success had been an elaborate illusion. Once these revelations came out, Enron's credibility evaporated almost overnight. Investors raced for the exits, dumping Enron stock. The share price, which had been in the $80s per share at its peak, plummeted to the teens and kept falling. The U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission opened a formal investigation into Enron's accounting practices. Credit rating agencies swiftly downgraded Enron's debt to junk status, meaning the company's creditworthiness was basically shot. For a trading enterprise like Enron, this was fatal. Without the confidence of investors and creditors, it couldn't continue to operate normally. Desperate to avoid collapse, Enron's leadership sought a savior. In November 2001, Enron entered merger talks with a smaller energy company, Dynegy. For a brief moment, it looked like Dynegy might buy Enron at a fire sale price, which would at least keep the company afloat. But as Dynegy's team pored over Enron's financials during due diligence, they discovered that the hole in Enron's finances was far deeper than anyone knew. There were billions in liabilities that had been kept off the books and assets that were nowhere near as valuable as Enron had claimed. Within weeks, Dynegy backed out of the deal, and Enron was out of options. On the 2nd of December 2001, Enron filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. It was the largest bankruptcy in U.S. history at that time, a shocking fall for a company that, just a year earlier, had been one of the most admired in the country. The fallout was devastating. In one blow, virtually all of Enron's employees lost their jobs. The company had employed over 20,000 people. Many of them also saw their life savings wiped out, because a lot of Enron's rank-and-file employees had their retirement funds heavily invested in Enron stock. As the stock crumbled, these employees were powerless to do anything about it. At one point during the crash, Enron had frozen the 401(k)s plans, preventing employees from selling their stock, ostensibly because of administrative changes. So they watched helplessly as the value of their retirement accounts evaporated day by day. Meanwhile, it later emerged that some top executives had been quietly unloading their own stock in the months before the company fell apart. Those revelations only deepened the sense of betrayal. Enron's leaders had spent years urging employees to keep faith with the company, to buy into its vision and, often, its stock. Now that trust was shattered. The people who had given their hearts and souls to Enron felt betrayed, angry, and devastated. News of Enron's bankruptcy dominated headlines around the world. In Houston, the company's gleaming headquarters fell eerily silent. Stunned employees were seen carrying boxes of their belongings out of Enron's offices, a once proud workforce now left uncertain of their futures. The company's famous E logo, which had long stood as a beacon of innovation, now became a symbol of corporate greed and failure. At the same time, Enron's collapse sparked a firestorm of investigations and public outrage. Congressional committees summoned Enron's leadership to Washington for hearings that were broadcast on national television. America watched senior Enron executives, once hailed as industry visionaries, either stonewall lawmakers or plead ignorance. Perhaps the only thing more shocking than Enron's collapse was the story that emerged of pervasive corporate deceit. And it wasn't just Enron's executives who were implicated. Enron's accounting firm, Arthur Andersen, one of the most respected audit firms in the world, was found to be deeply entwined in the scandal. Andersen auditors had approved Enron's dubious accounting, and when the SEC investigation began, Andersen employees shredded tons of Enron-related documents to cover their tracks. Andersen was indicted for obstruction of justice. The firm's conviction was later overturned, but by then Andersen was disgraced and essentially out of business. One of the big five accounting firms in the world imploded, all because of its role in Enron's fraud. The legal reckoning for Enron's own executives soon followed. Andrew Fastow, the mastermind of Enron's financial skullduggery, was charged with fraud, money laundering, and more. He struck a plea deal, agreeing to testify against his former colleagues in exchange for a shorter sentence. Fastow ended up serving about 5 years in prison. Jeff Skilling, who had been the golden boy of Enron, maintained that he'd done nothing wrong and fought the charges in court. In 2006, he was convicted on numerous counts of fraud and conspiracy. Initially, he received a 24-year prison sentence, though it was later reduced. He served around 12 years behind bars and was released in 2019. Ken Lay, the founder and longtime chairman, also faced multiple charges. He was found guilty on several counts in the same 2006 trial as Skilling. However, Lay died of a heart attack just a few months after the trial, before he could be sentenced, and his convictions were vacated after his death. The Enron scandal had far-reaching consequences beyond the company itself. It shattered confidence in corporate America and raised serious questions about accounting practices, corporate governance, and the integrity of financial markets. And Enron was just the beginning. In the months that followed, other companies like WorldCom and Tyco were found to have engaged in massive fraud of their own. It was as if Enron opened the floodgates, revealing that corporate fraud was more common than anyone wanted to believe. Investors were suddenly skeptical of companies that once seemed rock solid. Enron became a dirty word, a shorthand for the worst kinds of corporate malfeasance. Under intense public pressure, lawmakers knew they had to act. In July 2002, Congress passed the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, a sweeping reform law aimed at preventing the kind of abuses that Enron had perpetrated. Sarbanes-Oxley, often called SOX, imposed strict new rules for public companies and their auditors. It required CEOs and CFOs to personally certify the accuracy of financial statements, making them legally accountable for any misrepresentation. It forced companies to strengthen internal controls to detect fraud. It protected whistleblowers like Sharon Watkins, so employees could report wrongdoing without fear of retaliation. The law also set up a new regulatory board to oversee the auditing profession and barred audit firms from simultaneously doing lucrative consulting work for the same clients, a conflict of interest that had arguably helped enable Enron's deceit. These changes didn't stop all corporate fraud, of course, but they significantly tightened the rules and closed many of the loopholes that Enron had so gleefully exploited. Years later, the legacy of Enron is still with us. In business schools, Enron's story is taught as a cautionary tale of how hubris, greed, and unethical behavior can destroy even the mightiest company. In corporate boardrooms, the phrase, "We don't want another Enron," is a sober warning to follow the rules and do the right thing. The scandal also entered popular culture through books and documentaries. One famous documentary about Enron was tellingly titled "The Smartest Guys in the Room," a reference to how Enron's top executives believed they were smarter than everyone else. They were smart, but in the end, their lack of integrity proved to be their undoing. Ultimately, Enron's rise and fall serves as a stark lesson about the importance of transparency and ethics in business. The company's leaders pursued innovation and growth at any cost, and they crossed the line into fraud. For a while, they fooled the world and lived lavishly off their lies. But once the truth came out, the fall was swift and brutal. Enron's collapse inflicted real pain on thousands of people and shook the economic system, but it also led to reforms meant to ensure no company could ever pull off a deception of that scale again. It's a story we remember because it revealed the dark side of corporate ambition, and because it reminds us that trust, once broken, can bring down even the mightiest of giants. In the end, the Enron saga is a sobering reminder that in business, as in life, the truth eventually comes out, and when it does, the consequences of deception can be catastrophic.